One man crawled across an open wheat field in broad daylight toward 4 German machine guns that could see everything, hit anything, and had already killed dozens trying the same approach. He made it. All 4 guns went silent. The battalion broke through. And if you think courage alone explains how he survived what should have been suicide, you understand nothing about what happened on that Italian hillside in June of 1944. This is not a story about bravery. This is a story about geometry, patience, and the invisible angles between life and death. The morning of June 2, 1944, arrived over the Italian countryside with the kind of crystalline clarity that photographers dream of and soldiers dread. Near the village of Villa Crochetta, 15 miles south of Rome, the sun rose into a sky scrubbed clean by overnight winds, revealing every contour of the terrain with pitiless precision. The wheat had reached that late spring height where it no longer concealed a prone man but remained too short to hide movement, the stalks golden and brittle, rustling with every breath of air that moved across the hillside. The German Caesar Line, the last major defensive position before Rome itself, ran through these fields like a scar, and every man in the American 100th Infantry Battalion understood that crossing this open ground meant entering what the Wehrmacht called a Vernichtungszone, a zone of annihilation, where overlapping fields of fire transformed landscape into killing floor. Technical Sergeant Yaiki Kobashigawa stood among his squad at the wood line, studying the slope ahead with eyes that had learned to read terrain long before he ever wore a uniform. He was 24 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, born on the island of Oahu to parents who had crossed an ocean to cut sugarcane and build a life from volcanic soil and brutal labor. His face carried the compact geometry of Japanese ancestry that made him, in the eyes of many Americans, indistinguishable from the enemy, despite the uniform he wore and the 3 previous campaigns he had survived. The 100th Battalion, composed entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, had already earned the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion for losses that would have destroyed most units twice over. They had bled through North Africa, waded ashore at Salerno, clawed up mountains at Monte Cassino, and now they stood before this wheat field, this impossible crossing, this final barrier before the Eternal City. The German positions were not hidden. They did not need to be, for MG-42 machine gun nests sat in plain view, dug into the hillside in a textbook deployment that any Wehrmacht machine gun instructor would have approved without revision. The geometry was perfect. Each position commanded overlapping sectors of fire, creating a lattice of death with no gaps, no blind spots, no safe approach. The gunners could see the entire slope, from the American wood line to their own fortified positions, a distance of perhaps 400 meters across open ground with cover so minimal it might as well have been a parade field. They had time, elevation, and the most feared machine gun ever produced by German engineering. The MG-42, which Allied soldiers called Hitler's Buzzsaw, fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, a cyclic rate so high that individual shots blurred into a single tearing sound like ripping canvas, a noise that bypassed rational thought and triggered something primal in the human brain. The weapon's recoil-operated bolt assembly cycled so rapidly that tracers appeared as solid lines of light rather than individual projectiles. A 3-second burst put 60 rounds downrange, and experienced gunners could walk fire across a target area with precision that turned movement into instant death. The weapon fed from belted ammunition, eliminating the capacity limitations that forced other machine guns to pause and reload. A competent crew could sustain fire almost indefinitely, and the crews on this hillside were very competent indeed. They had held this position for days, repelling attacks, stacking bodies in the wheat, learning the exact range to every tree, rock, and fold in the ground that might offer concealment. But the MG-42, for all its lethality, had limitations that were architectural rather than mechanical, constraints imposed by physics and the necessary compromises of field deployment. The weapon fired from a tripod mount, the Lafette 42, which provided stability for sustained accurate fire but also imposed rigid geometric constraints on the gun's traverse and depression. The tripod's design limited downward angle, particularly at close range, creating what experienced soldiers called the dead zone, a narrow band of terrain directly in front of the gun where the barrel simply could not be depressed far enough to bring fire to bear on a target pressed flat against the earth. This zone existed not as a design flaw but as an inevitable consequence of mechanical reality. The gun could not shoot through the ground, and the tripod could not fold space. For a man crawling on his belly, moving with infinite slowness, This narrow band represented the difference between geometry and death, between physics and courage, between a battlefield principle that most soldiers understood theoretically and one man who would stake his life on understanding it perfectly. Kobashigawa had been born into the understanding that survival came from reading an environment more carefully than it could read you. The mountains of Oahu, the rainforests rising behind the sugar plantations where his father worked 12-hour days, had taught him lessons that no military manual contained. As a boy, he had hunted wild boar in terrain where the animal's senses exceeded his own, where movement meant failure, where patience was not virtue but requirement. The boar could smell fear, hear heartbeat, detect the unnatural rhythm of human breath from distances that made rifle range irrelevant. To approach required becoming part of the landscape, moving only when wind masked sound, only when shadow absorbed silhouette, only when the animal's attention turned elsewhere. He had learned to measure time not in minutes but in heartbeats, to move not in steps but in inches, to become so still that his own body forgot motion, and then to move again with a control so complete it appeared supernatural. These were not military skills. The army had not taught him to read wind direction by watching wheat stalks 200 meters away. The army had not taught him to distinguish between the restless scanning of a bored sentry and the focused attention of a gunner who had seen something. The army had not taught him that the human eye responds to movement before shape, that peripheral vision detects motion that direct focus misses, that shadow matters more than color in daylight observation. But these lessons, learned in mountains and forests under circumstances where failure meant returning empty-handed rather than not returning at all, now translated into a language of survival that the moment demanded. The first attack had gone exactly as predicted. 2 squads, good men, brave men, had advanced across the wheat in a maneuver that military doctrine suggested might succeed through speed and suppressive fire. They had made it perhaps 60 meters before the MG-42s opened fire, and the sound was not the distinct crack of rifle fire but the sustained roar of industrial slaughter, as if the hillside itself had begun screaming. Men fell in clusters, in pairs, alone, some killed instantly, others hit and crawling, still others frozen in place by a fear so absolute it overrode survival instinct. The wheat around them exploded into chaff and dust as hundreds of rounds per second intersected with stalk and soil and flesh. Those who made it back did so by crawling, by clawing dirt, by abandoning weapons and equipment and dignity, driven by nothing but the animal need to escape the kill zone. The wounded who could not crawl remained where they fell, calling for medics who could not reach them, their voices growing weaker as the morning sun climbed higher and shock set in and the day's heat began to work its own slow killing. The company commander, a Haole officer from Pennsylvania who had learned to respect the Nisei soldiers if not yet fully understand them, stood at the wood line and stared at the wheat field with the expression of a man performing mathematics with bodies instead of numbers. He had orders to take those positions. He had a battalion that needed this road. He had superiors who saw maps, not wheat fields, who calculated objectives in kilometers rather than corpses. And he had before him a problem that traditional tactics could not solve without losses his unit could not sustain. Kobashigawa did not wait for orders. He understood something that rank and doctrine often obscured, that some problems could not be solved by groups but only by individuals, that some terrain could not be taken by assault but only by infiltration, that some moments required not courage but its opposite, the complete suppression of the instinct to act, replaced by a patience so profound it resembled meditation. He removed his helmet, set aside his pack, checked his Thompson submachine gun and the grenades clipped to his harness, and told his squad leader he was going forward. Not we, but I. Not to attack but to reach. The crawl began at the wood line, at the exact point where shadow ended and sunlight began, where concealment gave way to exposure, where the decision could still be reversed. He went to ground not like a soldier taking cover but like an animal returning to earth, his body flattening until every contour pressed against soil, until he became a shape without silhouette, a presence without profile. The wheat rose around him, not high enough to hide him but sufficient to break his outline if he remained absolutely motionless, and stillness was a language his body spoke fluently. The first meter took 3 minutes. He moved only his elbows and the toes of his boots, dragging himself forward with increments so small they appeared as settling rather than motion, as if gravity rather than volition shifted his position. His breathing slowed until each inhalation took 8 seconds, each exhalation 10. A rhythm that kept his chest from rising and falling in the telltale pattern that draws the eye. The wheat around him swayed in the breeze, and he moved only when wind moved the stalks, only when the entire field shimmered with motion that disguised his own. When wind stopped, he stopped mid-movement, holding position until muscles burned and nerves screamed and the wind returned. The sun climbed higher, and with it came heat that transformed the wheat field into a furnace. The soil beneath him, baked hard by weeks of sun and minimal rain, radiated warmth that rose through his uniform and pressed against his chest and face until sweat began to soak through fabric and run into his eyes. He could not wipe it away. Any hand movement would create a shape, a gesture, something the eye could catch and the mind could recognize as human. So the sweat ran, stinging his eyes, pooling in the hollow of his throat, soaking his collar, while he blinked slowly and continued forward, one elbow length at a time. Insects found him within the first 10 minutes. Ants, disturbed by his presence, swarmed across his hands and up his sleeves, biting with the acidic fury of creatures defending their territory. Flies landed on his face, his neck, the backs of his hands, drawn by sweat and salt and the still fresh scent of blood from the morning's attack that lingered in the air. He could not swat them. He could not shake his head. He could only continue forward while they crawled across his skin and bit and fed, and he accepted this as the price of motion, as the cost of becoming part of the landscape. 20 meters from the wood line, still 380 meters from the nearest machine gun nest, he stopped for 17 minutes. Not because he needed rest, though his muscles had begun to cramp from the sustained tension of controlled movement, but because he had seen something change in the pattern of the nearest gun position. The barrel had shifted, traversing slowly left, and this meant the gunner had either seen something or thought he had seen something, which meant attention had focused in a specific direction, which meant the probability of detection had increased. So Kobashigawa stopped, became stone, became earth, became nothing worth noticing, and waited until the barrel resumed its slow mechanical sweep of the entire field and the moment of danger passed. The Germans were not incompetent. They were veterans, survivors of the Eastern Front and North Africa, men who had fought in conditions that made Italy seem pastoral. They knew their weapons. They understood fields of fire and dead zones and the geometry of killing ground. But they were human, and human attention cannot sustain perfect focus indefinitely. Eyes tire. Concentration drifts. The mind begins to see patterns in randomness, and after hours of staring at wheat that moves only with wind, the brain stops processing each individual stalk and begins to treat the entire field as a single entity, a surface rather than a collection of elements. This is not weakness. This is neurology. And Kobashigawa was betting his life on the absolute inevitability of human limitation. 50 meters out, he entered the zone where previous attacks had died. The wheat here was shorter, trampled and torn by morning fire, and the ground held dark stains that had not yet baked into the soil. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some American, some German from earlier fighting, all of them beginning to bloat in the heat, becoming obstacles that created their own small shadows, their own fields of concealment. He navigated between them, using their positions to break his silhouette, timing his movement so that from the German perspective, his slow creep appeared as nothing more than shadow shifting as the sun changed angle. The smell was profound, a mixture of blood and shit and the beginning stages of decay, cut through with the chemical stink of explosives and the metallic scent of spent brass. He breathed through his mouth in slow, shallow draws, and continued forward. 100 meters from the nearest nest, close enough now to hear voices speaking German, close enough to hear the mechanical rattle of ammunition belts being adjusted, he stopped again and reassessed. The lead gun position sat in a fortified pit, surrounded by sandbags in the orthodox configuration, with the MG-42 mounted center and elevated to provide maximum field of fire. 2 men visible, probably a third in the pit feeding ammunition or preparing to rotate positions. The gun barrel pointed directly at the wood line, covering the most likely avenue of approach, which meant its traverse was oriented away from Kobashigawa's current position. The geometry was becoming clearer. The dead zone existed, but reaching it required crossing the final 100 meters, which remained the most dangerous distance of all. He had been crawling for 2 hours. His uniform was soaked through with sweat, his elbows raw from dragging across hard earth, his knees aching from the constant micro-adjustments required to propel himself forward without creating visible movement. Thirst had become a physical presence, a dryness in his throat that swallowing could not alleviate, but his canteen remained strapped to his belt, untouched, because the act of drinking required movement that would kill him. Time had lost conventional meaning. He did not think in minutes or hours but in breath counts and wind cycles, in the rhythm of observation and motion that had become its own form of consciousness. 150 meters. 125. 100. The voices grew clearer. He could distinguish individual words now, though his German was limited to the phrases that combat teaches. Achtung, Führer, Amerikaner. He could hear someone laughing, a sound incongruous and human, and this reminded him that the men in that pit were not monsters but soldiers, scared and far from home, doing what they were ordered to do because the alternative was unthinkable. He felt no hatred toward them. Hatred would have clouded judgment, and judgment was the only thing keeping him alive. 75 meters. The angle changed. He could see now that the machine gun's field of fire was indeed limited by the tripod's depression angle, that the dead zone existed as theory predicted, but reaching it required passing through a section of ground where the wheat had been completely flattened, where no concealment remained whatsoever, where he would be visible to anyone who happened to glance in the right direction at the right moment. There was no avoiding this section. There was no alternative route. There was only the choice to continue or retreat, and retreat meant the attack failed, the battalion stalled, more men died attempting what he was attempting now. He waited for a cloud. The morning had been crystalline, but afternoon was bringing the kind of high, thin overcast that diffuses light without blocking sun, and when the first cloud passed overhead, the quality of illumination changed, became flatter, eliminated some of the sharp shadows that made shapes distinct. It was not much. It was barely anything, but it was enough. He moved across the flattened section in a single sustained crawl that took 90 seconds, abandoning the stop-start rhythm that had carried him this far, gambling everything on the hope that motion during this brief change in light would read as shadow rather than threat. The German gunner did not turn. The barrel did not swing. And then he was through into slightly higher wheat and the first edge of the dead zone. 30 meters. 20. 15. He could smell them now, cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies and the oil they used to maintain their weapon. He could hear breathing, the scrape of boot against sandbag, the metallic click of someone adjusting a helmet strap. His hand found the first grenade, pulled the pin with a pressure so gentle the spring made almost no sound, and he counted 3 seconds in his mind before throwing, before everything became noise and motion and the complete abandonment of stealth for violence. The grenade arced into the pit and detonated with a sound that shattered the afternoon stillness into fragments. He was up and moving before the echo faded, Thompson in hand, firing into smoke and confusion and the shapes of men who had not yet understood what was happening. The machine gun fell silent. The second gunner reached for it and died before his hand made contact. The third man, the ammunition feeder, lunged from the pit and ran 3 steps before Kobashigawa's burst caught him between the shoulders and knocked him forward into the wheat. The other 3 gun positions opened fire instantly, but they were firing at the nest, at the smoke and noise, not at the wheat field where a single American had spent 2 hours becoming invisible. Their fire was high, tearing through the position he had just taken, suppressing what they assumed was an assault force rather than a lone infiltrator. He was already moving, crawling again but faster now because stealth had failed and speed was the only advantage remaining. The second nest sat 60 meters to the right, and between his position and theirs lay a vineyard, rows of grapevines planted in the methodical parallel lines that Italian farmers had maintained even as war rolled across their land. The vines were not high, barely waist level, but they provided visual barriers, shadows, something other than flat ground, and Kobashigawa used them the way he had used the wheat, moving between rows, using posts as reference points, advancing on the nest from an angle they were not defending because they remained focused on the position he had already taken. This time there was no extended crawl. This time was about speed and violence, about crossing the distance before they repositioned their gun, before they understood the threat's direction. He covered the 60 meters in 40 seconds, diving and rolling and advancing through terrain that infantry manuals said could not be crossed under machine gun fire, but the manuals assumed the machine guns were oriented correctly, and these guns were still firing at ghosts. The second nest died almost identically to the first. Grenade into the pit, Thompson fire into the aftermath. 3 Germans dead before they rotated their barrel far enough to matter. But the third and fourth positions had observed now. They understood. A single man, alone, killing gun crews with grenades and close-range fire. They adjusted, redirecting their weapons, coordinating their fire to create overlapping coverage that made approach from any angle lethal. Kobashigawa did not attack the third position immediately. He waited in the captured second nest, using their sandbags for cover, watching the remaining guns, studying their new fire patterns, understanding that the situation had fundamentally changed. He was no longer invisible. The element of surprise had burned away like morning fog. The remaining Germans knew he was coming, knew his tactics, and had prepared a response that turned the advantage back to them. Traditional assault would fail. Conventional tactics would get him killed. His squad had been watching. They had seen the first 2 nests go silent. They had seen their sergeant, alone in enemy territory, systematically dismantling positions that were supposed to be impregnable. And now they moved forward without orders, because some things do not require orders, because some moments create their own imperatives. They advanced across the wheat field in dispersed formation, using the path Kobashigawa had created, moving faster than he had because attention was divided now, because the remaining German guns could not cover everything simultaneously. The third nest faced a different kind of attack. Not infiltration but suppression, coordinated fire from multiple positions, grenades thrown in sequence to keep defenders down, while riflemen advanced from 3 directions. The geometry became addition rather than subtraction. Force multiplied rather than force avoided. The nest fought back, the MG-42 firing in controlled bursts, and 2 Americans fell in the wheat, and then 4, but the advance continued because momentum had shifted, because hesitation meant death and motion meant maybe survival. The nest fell when a rifle grenade hit the sandbag wall and blew an opening through which 3 Nisei soldiers poured fire until nothing moved inside. The fourth position was the strongest. Not just a machine gun nest but a reinforced bunker with overhead cover, firing ports, interlocking fields of fire from supporting rifle positions. It had been sited to defend against the exact kind of assault that was now coming, and it held for 23 minutes, firing until barrels glowed red, until ammunition ran low, until an American mortar crew finally ranged the position and walked fire across the bunker, until smoke grenades provided cover for a final assault that Kobashigawa led personally, moving through smoke that burned lungs and obscured vision, firing blindly into the structure until grenades finished what bullets had started. By 1600 hours, the hillside was American. For machine gun nests, 21 German dead, the road to Villa Crochetta open, the Caesar line broken at this critical point. The 100th Battalion advanced through the gap Kobashigawa had created, pouring through the breach like water through a cracked dam, and behind them came more units, more men, more equipment, until the entire offensive resumed motion that had been stalled for 3 days. Kobashigawa sat in the shade of an overturned German half-track and drank from a canteen that someone had handed him, water that tasted of metal and chemicals, and was the most perfect thing he had ever consumed. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from the aftereffects of sustained adrenaline, from muscles that had held tension for hours and now released it all at once. His squad gathered around him, some wounded, some whole, all of them looking at their sergeant with expressions that mixed respect and incomprehension, because what they had witnessed did not fit into their understanding of how war worked. The company commander arrived an hour later, after the front had moved forward another kilometer, after engineers had begun clearing mines and improving the road, after the reality of success had replaced the anticipation of failure. He looked at Kobashigawa, at this Japanese-American sergeant whose parents could not own land in the country he was defending, whose brother was serving in the same battalion after being released from an internment camp, whose very presence in uniform represented a contradiction that America had not yet learned to resolve. The commander recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork was filed. The recommendation was reviewed, reconsidered, downgraded, and 6 weeks later, Kobashigawa received the Distinguished Service Cross, which was a high honor but not the highest, which was recognition but not full recognition, which was progress but not justice. Rome fell 2 days later. The 100th Battalion entered the city not as conquerors but as liberators, and Italian civilians lined the streets and threw flowers and wept with relief, and for a brief moment, The color of a soldier's skin mattered less than the flag on his shoulder. The battalion had suffered 40% casualties since landing at Salerno, had been rebuilt twice, had fought through every major engagement of the Italian campaign, and would continue fighting until Germany surrendered, losing men to the very last day, becoming the most decorated unit of its size in American military history, earning that distinction through blood and skill and a determination to prove loyalty that should never have required proving. Kobashigawa survived the war. He returned to Hawaii, to the islands where he had learned to hunt boar and red wind and move through terrain like water through stone. He worked in landscaping, married, raised children, lived a quiet life that bore no external resemblance to the afternoon when he had crawled across a wheat field toward impossible odds and survived. He did not speak often about the war. This was common among veterans, this silence, but in his case the silence carried additional weight, because his war had been fought on two fronts, against an enemy that shot at him and against a country that doubted him. In the year 2000, 56 years after the wheat field, after most of the men who had witnessed it were dead, after decades of advocacy by Japanese-American veterans groups and historians who understood that some injustices persist in official records long after they end in practice, the United States government reviewed the wartime decorations of Asian American soldiers. The review found what everyone who had studied the records already knew, that the bar for recognition had been set higher for these men, that equivalent actions by white soldiers had received higher awards, that institutional bias had written itself into the paper trail of heroism. The Distinguished Service Cross that Kobashigawa had received in 1944 was upgraded to the Medal of Honor, and in a White House ceremony, President Bill Clinton placed the nation's highest decoration around the neck of an old man whose hands still remembered the texture of Italian soil and the weight of a Thompson submachine gun and the terrible patience required to crawl toward death slowly enough to survive it. Kobashigawa died in 2005 at the age of 87, having lived long enough to see his tactics enter military doctrine, to see infantry schools teach the principles of dead zones and depression angles and the geometry of machine gun fire that he had understood intuitively on a hillside in Italy. His story became case study, became example, became the kind of teaching moment that instructors use to illustrate that warfare is not always about firepower and force but sometimes about understanding terrain and weapon limitations and the gap between what an enemy can see and what they can hit. The wheat field is gone now. Villa Crochetta is a cluster of houses on a road that tourists take to Rome without knowing what happened on this hillside 70 years ago. The land has been plowed and planted and harvested 10,000 times since 1944, and nothing remains to mark the place where one man demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear but the presence of understanding, that heroism is not rushing toward danger but moving toward it slowly enough to arrive alive, that the space between invincible and vulnerable is sometimes measured in inches and angles and the patience to wait for wind. What Kobashigawa did on June 2, 1944, has been studied by every serious military that understands infantry combat. The principles he demonstrated, terrain analysis, mechanical limitations of weapon systems, stealth over speed, patience over aggression, these have become foundational concepts in modern tactics. But the story itself, the specific afternoon, the wheat field, the crawl, this has remained obscure outside military circles, known to specialists and historians but not embedded in popular consciousness the way some war stories become legend. Perhaps this is because his war was not the war of movies and monuments. Perhaps because his face did not fit the narrative that America preferred to tell itself about who fought and why and what their sacrifice meant. But the men who were there, who watched him disappear into that wheat field and emerge victorious, who followed the path he created and survived because of it, who went home to lives made possible by his understanding and skill, these men knew. They told their children, who told their children, and in this way, the story survived even when official recognition did not, passed down through families and communities that understood that some things matter regardless of whether medals acknowledge them. There is a geometry to survival that transcends courage. There is an angle where bullets cannot reach. There is a speed of movement slow enough to become invisible. There is a patience profound enough to defeat firepower. Kobashigawa understood this not because he was taught but because he listened to wind in mountains, watched animals that survived by understanding their environment better than their predators understood them, learned that the prey who masters observation outlives the predator who relies on strength. He brought this understanding to a wheat field in Italy and used it to break a line that conventional tactics could not crack, and in doing so, demonstrated something that military planners are still learning. That sometimes the most effective weapon is not the one that fires the most rounds but the mind that understands where rounds cannot reach. The story asks questions that do not resolve cleanly. How much courage does it take to move slowly toward death? How much discipline to remain still when every instinct screams to run? How much faith in geometry and physics and mechanical limitations to stake your life on theories that have never been tested under conditions where failure means you die before you hear the shot that kills you? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the practical mathematics of a specific afternoon, and Kobashigawa answered them in the most definitive way possible, by living. If this story has moved you, if you have found something valuable in this account of patience and precision, and one man's understanding that intelligence can defeat firepower, I ask you to take a moment to engage with this content in a meaningful way. Subscribe to this channel if you want more history told with the depth and respect it deserves. Like this video if you believe stories like Kobashigawa's deserve to be remembered. Share it with someone who appreciates military history, or tactical analysis, or simply stories of human beings performing at the absolute edge of capability. And I want to hear from you in the comments. When you think about courage, do you think about the soldier who charges directly into fire, or the one who moves so slowly toward danger that movement itself becomes invisible? Is there more bravery in the rush or in the crawl? In noise or in silence? These questions matter because they shape how we understand not just war but challenge itself, not just heroism but skill, not just history but the nature of excellence under impossible conditions. Tell me what you think. The conversation matters as much as the story. And if you want to explore more accounts like this, more moments where individual skill changed outcomes that force could not, I have an entire catalog of content that approaches military history not as mythology but as mechanics, not as glorification but as understanding. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for keeping alive the story of a man who crawled across a wheat field and changed a battle through patience that looked like stillness and stillness that became victory.